I'm not making a firm prediction on the date the next major dollar and banking crisis will hit. If I were president now, I could bring this under control very quickly and begin to turn the economy around slightly over the next several months. So far, George's friends, using almost every trick in the book, have failed to control the financial crisis any better than Hoover did back in 1930. Let's take a quick look at the reason Bush's friends are doomed to fail in their efforts. Now, imagine we're back in October 1929. I drop this ball. Let's see how that looks on the Wall Street Journal's chart. The picture isn't exactly the same, but the general idea is about the same. Now, come back to the middle of October 1987. The ball I'm holding is not the same ball I dropped back in 1929, but it is a similar ball. The same thing happens with this ball in 1987 and 1988 that happened in 1929 and 1930. Why should an economy act like a bouncing ball, back in Hoover's time and again today? One reason is that the Reagan-Bush administration has acted almost exactly as the Coolidge and Hoover administrations acted to create the Great Depression of the 1930s. If our government in 1988 makes exactly the same mistakes which the Hoover administration made back in 1930, the results will be approximately the same. Times change, but the laws of nature do not. There are physical laws which cause a financial collapse to resemble a bouncing ball whenever a financial collapse is caused by a prolonged contraction of industrial and agricultural production. All of the ordinary rules of market behavior go out the window. Once the crisis begins, the financial markets do not go all the way to the bottom in the first panic. After the first drop, the markets tend to stabilize so that foolish people may believe that a recovery has begun. A few months later, the next drop comes, and then a temporary stabilization at a lower level before the next drop. This is not the place to explain the physical principles involved, but you see the general idea. We must look back to 1982 to understand how Ronald Reagan and George Bush set us up for a 1989 collapse, which could be the worst depression of the 20th century. Back in 1982, I was collaborating with the Reagan administration in developing the policy which became known as the SDI. We were considering two things at the time. As most of you know, by March of 1983, the President shared my view that we have the scientific potential to end the time in which our people must continue living in helpless fear of Soviet missiles. Back in 1983, the President and I also shared the hope that Moscow might join us in supporting an SDI policy. I was also projecting the impact of an SDI program on the economy. If we assist U.S. industries to make job-creating investments in the advanced technologies spilled over from SDI development, the payback to the economy in more jobs and income would be much more than we spend for the SDI. Therefore, it was my duty to indicate any important breaking developments in the international economy. During early 1982, I warned the administration that the Latin American debt bomb was going to explode during 1982. That June, I warned Mexico's President Jose Lopez Portillo in the White House that the Mexican debt bomb was going to explode by no later than September. I produced a book-length report, Operation Juarez, which presented in detail the joint actions which would be taken by the U.S. and Latin American governments at the time the Mexico debt bomb exploded. That August, the Mexico debt bomb exploded. Mexico acted immediately on the basis of the proposals which I had outlined in my Operation Juarez plan of action. Unfortunately, President Reagan went in the opposite direction and forced Mexico to cancel those recovery measures. The international financial crisis we are experiencing today is a direct result of those policy decisions made by the Reagan-Bush administration during October 1982. If you look into the financial figures, you will see that beginning October 1982, the U.S. banking system began to build up the biggest international financial bubble in history. As a result of President Reagan's continuing the policy he adopted during October 1982, U.S. financial income zoomed over the 5 years from October 1982 to October 1987. But the level of physical production inside the United States collapsed at a rate of between 2 and 5% a year during 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, and 1987. As a direct result of the President's rejecting my proposal, U.S. export markets collapsed, leading to the terribly dangerous balance of payments crisis we are facing today. During the 5 years of the so-called Reagan recovery, our infrastructure rotted away, more and more of the most productive farms in the world were pushed into bankruptcy while industries collapsed, and more communities and families were pushed into misery. This rot, bankruptcy, and misery is what the President called his recovery. By October of 1987, reality caught up with President Reagan. His bubble popped, just as a similar bubble popped for President Hoover back in 1929. So the ball bounces.
That video clip, by the way, was from a nationwide TV broadcast from Lyndon's presidential campaign in 1988. Okay. The worst financial collapse in the last 650 years is now underway as a result of the economic policies imposed upon governments by the international oligarchy and their functionaries, the international bankers. There are no isolated financial problems. The problems of Orange County, the problems in Mexico, the financial crisis in state and local governments across the country, the financial crises in corporations and financial institutions, the financial crises with governments around the world are all symptoms of this single international financial collapse. This process of collapse was defined by Lyndon LaRouche in his 8th economic forecast, November 23, 1991, as a mudslide in which huge chunks of the financial system slide into oblivion. Many people have been looking for a definitive one-day, two-day, three-day financial collapse, perhaps on the markets, with the Dow Jones Index crashing 500 or 1,000 points or more, LaRouche said. What they are seeing is the great mudslide of 1991. Huge chunks of the financial system have indeed disappeared. Since the October 1987 508-point stock market crash, the ones the experts said we survived intact, the real estate market collapsed, the Texas banking system disappeared, huge chunks of the savings and loan system were seized by regulators, the junk bond and leverage buyout markets crashed, the Federal Reserve took over the largest bank in the country and bailed out, they thought, the banking system. What has occurred is a string of disasters in which institutions, indeed whole segments of the economy, have disappeared. With all this collapse, one asks, why is the system still standing? The answer is that the financial system, as most people think of it, no longer exists. The financial system has been transformed into a huge casino through the use of derivatives and other forms of speculation and looting. Slide 1, please. Slide 1 shows the growth of derivatives worldwide. Derivatives have grown from $1.1 trillion at the end of 1986 to $45 trillion at the end of 1994, a more than 40-fold growth in 8 years. The notional principal amount of derivatives, a fancy way of saying face value, rose by 47% in 1987, 65% in 1988, 58% in 1989, 38% in 1990, 32% in 1991, 58% in 1992, 33% in 1993, and if these numbers aren't big enough, a staggering 181% in 1994. A reasonable question at this point is, just what are derivatives? Well, derivatives are securities based upon the value of other securities, such as stocks, bonds, commodities, interest rates, currency securities, and indices of such securities. Some of these derivatives are technically so complex that the people trading them don't really understand them. But they're conceptually quite simple. Derivatives are bets, as in gambling, on future movements of the markets which are routinely manipulated by the bankers, as opposed to investments in the economies which those markets nominally support. Money that goes into the derivatives bubble comes out of the real economy. It's taken out of the physical economy in the same way that a malignant cancer grows by consuming its host. Derivatives do not hedge against risk, as the bankers say. Derivatives are the risk. Now, I should add here that the growth of derivatives, these figures come from the international bankers and from market-watching agencies. So the growth here may change a bit because at first it was just the bankers who were reporting it, the central banks, and they're prone, shall we say, to understatement about their exposure. And then towards the end, as more and more people begin to worry about this, you get other so-called market-watching companies who come in and report the numbers. So the growth may be a little bit different, but you can be sure that $45 trillion is the absolute minimum, because even the market-watching companies understate. So these are the best published figures that we can get, but it may actually be worse. Okay, slide 2, please. This extraordinary growth rate has nothing to do with economic growth, as this slide shows. It's obvious from looking at this graph that the derivatives market is insane. Between 1980 and 1994, the gross domestic product of the United States grew by 143% overall, a rate of growth of 5.6% a year. During the 8 years of the derivatives bubble, gross domestic product grew by 65%, or 5.6% a year, while derivatives grew 4,055%, a rate of 56% a year. The situation is actually even worse than it looks, if such a thing were possible, since gross domestic product, like the gross national product statistic it recently replaced, is a profoundly flawed economic statistic containing all sorts of non-economic activity. In truth, the real economy, the physical economy, has been shrinking during this period. To understand how this came about, let us go back briefly to the beginning of the 1980s, the so-called Reagan-Bush economic miracle. The alleged economic growth of the 1980s was fueled by a massive growth in government, corporate, and individual debt. Total U.S. credit market debt grew from some $6 trillion at the beginning of the decade to $14 trillion at decade's end. Much of this debt was incurred for speculative purposes, to buy overvalued real estate, to buy companies through leveraged buyouts, and such. That process worked after a fashion, thanks especially to the huge amounts of dope money which were poured into the real estate market through the banks. But things began to go wrong in 1986, 1987, when the drop in the price of oil punctured the Texas real estate markets. Within a couple of years, the 6 major Texas banks were gone. The Texas S&Ls were devastated. The junk bond-fed leveraged buyout market soon followed, killed by its seeming crown jewel, the $26 billion takeover of RJR Nabisco by Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. The collapse of the real estate and the junk bond markets, combined with the uncollectability of the bank's loans to less developed countries, threw the U.S. banking system into a bankruptcy crisis. Things were beginning to fall apart.
Any better than Hoover did back in 1930. Let's take a quick look at the reason Bush's friends are doomed to fail in their efforts. Now, imagine we're back in October 1929. I drop this ball. The same thing happens with this ball in 1987 and 1988 that happened in 1929 and 1930. Why should an economy act like a bouncing ball, back in Hoover's time and again today? One reason is that the Reagan-Bush administration has acted almost exactly. I'm not making a firm prediction on the date the next major dollar and banking crisis will hit. If I were president now, I could bring this under control very quickly and begin to turn the economy around slightly over the next several months. So far, George's friends, using almost every trick in the book, have failed to control the financial crisis. Let's see how that looks on the Wall Street Journal's chart. The picture isn't exactly the same, but the general idea is about the same. Now, come back to the middle of October 1987. The ball I'm holding is not the same ball I dropped back in 1929, but it is a similar ball as the Coolidge and Hoover administrations acted to create the Great Depression of the 1930s. If our government in 1988 makes exactly the same mistakes which the Hoover administration made back in 1930, the results will be approximately the same. Times change, but the laws of nature do not.